Wargaming are going to be buffing over 90 vehicles within World of Tanks console, and today I'm going to give some of the vehicles that definitely need a buff, and hopefully when Wargaming do roll out these changes, which is coming on Tuesday with the release of the brand new season for World of Tanks, hopefully some of these vehicles are part of it. Now, Wargaming have given us the tech tree lines that will be part of these buffs, but I wanted to do a little video beforehand when they release the full information, which hopefully we'll get tomorrow, where we'll cover that in a separate news video as well. But these are some of the tanks that I feel like really do deserve some buffs. But the actual tech tree lines that Wargaming are focusing on with regards to the vehicles in the game that are going to be getting buffed, and we're talking stat changes and just improved in general, are these vehicles here. So these are the nations. We have the German nation, we also have the French nation, we've got some of the Italians as well that will be getting changed, we've got of course the Czech line as well, which will be getting buffs, hopefully buffs anyway, and then we've also got the Chinese vehicles too. So quite a few vehicles, and then out there they've also got some of the mercenary tanks which will be receiving some stat changes. We'll get into that as well, because I'm really hoping that they don't change certain vehicles in the mercenary line. So, starting off, we might as well go left to right with the tech tree lines that are going to have the proposed changes. And we'll start off with the German one, since it is the first one that is within their remit. So, for starting off, there is a whole host of German tier 10 vehicles, and this is not just including tier 10s, but we'll cover a couple of cases for each of the tech tree lines. But essentially, they'll be making some changes. Now, to start off with, I feel like pretty much the entirety of the German lights are in an okay spot. The RU-251 is amazing, Hawk 12 is a decent light tank, all of these lines. Maybe the Rheinmetall could do with a little bit of love, but it's really not that bad, and it works quite well. Maybe they'll buff the Alpha to 360, don't really know. Potentially could be a change that they could make to this tank, but overall didn't feel awful when I was playing it. A Leopard 1 and all of the tanks leading up to this tank are actually pretty good in a decent space right now. They don't have armor, but they have some really amazing DPM, and both the Leopard PTA and the Leopard 1 feel really nice in the game. Maybe what they will do, however, is buff the Leopard 1 to the point where it has 420 alpha like it does on PC, similar to the Leopard PTA as well. I believe that also gets 420 alpha, which might happen as part of these changes, just to keep it consistent throughout the board of Wargaming's products, maybe. But of course, console, completely separate entity, they don't actually have to follow anything that any of the other games do. Then we've got the E50M line. Now this line is a bit lackluster, at least when it comes to the E50M and the E50. Now main reason being is that the penetration values on the standard rounds of the E50 aren't great, which is why a lot of people are spamming APCR on this thing, but overall they work as you kind of would expect from a more heavily armoured German medium tank. Do I think that they're really bad in a terrible spot right now? Absolutely not. Are they meta and some of the best tanks in the game? Equally, no, I don't think so. So yeah, I think they're in an okay spot, and I don't think they need to get a huge buff. Maybe slight buffs to the turret armor of the E50M might come in slightly better, so that you can bounce at least a couple off of your turret, but overall don't think that they're in a horrible spot. Then we come down to the Tiger line and the E100, of course, being the top one. All of these tanks seem to be very good, apart from really the E100. And that's because the E100's armor feels a little bit lackluster. I don't think that it really gets a whole lot of armor other than the upper plate. Turret armor can be penned by premium rounds of tier 9s and above if they've got high penetration, and of course tier 10s with premium ammunition will basically go through the front of the turret of the E100 when it's not angled. So yeah, can be a real pain when you're playing a heavy tank that's supposed to be a brawler but can't really do that because the armor doesn't work. Then we come down to the previous line down to that. We've got the Tiger P. Now I'm focusing mainly on the higher tier vehicles, 7 to 10. Tiger P really could do with something changed about it. Maybe just slightly increase the speed or power to weight ratio. Because although it is supposed to be a slower version of the Tiger with slightly more armor, it really doesn't feel nice to play at all. It's very slow, it's sluggish, it feels horrible, to be honest with you. But I feel like this tank can be played well with the right player in it, but it's more about the player than the tank itself. Yeah, I feel like this tank is probably a sticking point for a lot of players in the game. Then we move on to the VK4502A, the VK4502B, and the Panzer 7. These are all pretty decent tanks. In general, I don't feel like they need a whole lot of changes. VKB could probably do with a little bit of a turret update to increase it, make it a little bit more strong from the front, because it can be a little bit of a pain to try and side scrape out with this tank. But yeah, is that going to make it super OP? I don't know. I feel like it would be in a nice spot if they just tinily buffed up the armor of this tank. And then we've got the super heavy German vehicles, the Maus, the Mauschen, and the VK1001P. All of these tanks are okay. The Maus being the best of the bunch, the Mauschen being pretty awful, and the VK1001P being pretty mediocre as well. Both of these vehicles feeling like it is just a case of being so slow for not really any gain. And although you do have nice alpha damage, it's still not the highest in the heavy tank category, so you kind of sacrifice almost everything for that armor, and the armor really doesn't work because your upper plate in the VK1001P can be penned by tier 10's premium rounds, which is great, considering that it's supposed to be a super heavy. And the turret is just a paper, like made of paper when you come up against higher tier vehicles, making it pretty much useless, as well as having a giant cupola, which can be penned by basically tier 7s and above with premium ammunition, and tier 8s and above with standard ammunition. So yeah, real pain to play this tank, as well as the lower plate being absolutely gigantic. So in terms of making these tanks slightly better in the game, actually worth using over playing something like an E75 or a Tiger 2, it would be just simply make them slightly more armoured, to the point where they might actually be able to bounce a couple of rounds and be a bit better in that regard, because the heavy tanks in the current state of World of Tanks feel really, really bad, because of the fact that everyone's got super duper accuracy with high penetration, and armor really doesn't work anywhere near as well as it used to with the RNG disparity. Combine that with auto aim accuracy, which is broken, literally borderline broken. How bad accuracy, as in how good accuracy is, but bad for the game, the auto aim meta is. My response to actually making it slightly better and the game's actual gameplay experience better is to nerf the auto aim, so that you have much worse accuracy if you're auto aiming someone, such that it's only supposed to be really used when you're in close quarters engagements where you don't need to actually aim. And so yeah, if you made it really bad dispersion when you're actually auto-aiming someone as opposed to actually aiming in using the sniper mode, this would be much better. Combine that with also having to actually look at the tank that you're aiming at when you try and auto-aim. The amount of times where someone's looking at like a 45-degree angle away from me, and then they press RB or R1 on PS4, and suddenly they're looking directly at me with super duper accuracy and they hit me whilst I'm actually aiming, trying to crest a ridge smartly, and they pen me, and you know, you end up actually missing with RNG when you're aiming. Of course, that is one tiny situation, but it happens a hell of a lot with regards to people snapping their turrets, and it shouldn't really be a part of the game. It should be a case of auto aim. It's supposed to be for light tanks when you're coming up super duper close to tanks, and of course when you're just trying to get a tracking on a vehicle, as opposed to you literally using auto aim because you know it's better than if you were to use actual free aim in certain scenarios. It should always be better with actual aiming, which may be a better change than just buffing the armor of some of these vehicles. Then we come down, we got the Ferdinand. The Ferdinand definitely needs a bit of love. This tank's armor is, once again, it's similar to the Tiger P, whereby comparatively to the J Panther 2, you sacrifice pretty much everything to be able to get the armor, which the armor doesn't work on the Ferdinand, as with the Tiger P. And so basically it's a case of, yeah, you're just a slower version of the J-Panther 2 that has more hit points. And for all intents and purposes, I think I'd much rather play the J-Panther 2. It's more exciting, more interesting, more fun than playing the Ferdinand. So with that being said, of course, some slight changes to the speed of this vehicle, and maybe giving it slightly better DPM than the J-Panther 2 could be a potential option. I think it would make the tank a little bit more interesting and more of a disparity between the J-Panther 2 and the Ferdinand. Of course, that being said, all of these tanks, the Jagdpanzer 4, J-Panther, J-Panther 2 and the Jagdtiger, all very good vehicles. Then you get up to the Jagdpanzer E100. This is a tank I would probably buff. In terms of how I would buff it, it would be to give it potentially... I would even go as far to say as to increase the whole traverse speed of the Aiguru and slightly buff the speed. I'm not talking absolutely majorly, I'm talking a few, like 5%, just to make it feel a little bit less sluggish, because with all of the Tyrans and all of the high alpha TDs we have now that have all of the aspects that the Aiguru doesn't, as well as having high alpha, the only real thing that the Aiguru has over them is the armor model, of which, as I said, armor really doesn't matter a whole lot in this game anymore. And so yeah, just another case of an old vehicle that relied on armor when armor worked much better, and has made it just basically redundant over playing something like a Tyran or even some of the other vehicles from the German line like the Gorilla, because they have similar sorts of alpha except you're much faster, and being more flexible in a game usually makes the tank much better because you're not capped by a tank as opposed to the game. Of course, then we lead on to the derp German tanks in terms of buffing some of these. The Bar, this is the tank that I would buff. I actually don't mind the Sturmpanzer or the Sturmtiger P. I think that they are, you know, as it says on the tin, they're supposed to be derp cannons, pretty inaccurate, quite slow, sluggish, but they have that huge alpha where it's a reward, almost thinking of it of like a KV2. The Bar, however, makes it so difficult for you to be able to actually aim at people because of the fact it has 1 degree of gun depression. In essence, my opinion on how to actually make this tank more usable is just to give it an extra 2 degrees of gun depression, make it have 3 degrees of gun depression total, and this tank would be actually usable. Without that, it just basically becomes an artillery piece that can't hit anyone. And although this might not be historically accurate to how the tank was, because at the end of the day it probably was a artillery piece or something like that, yeah, it makes it unusable in this arcade game that we play. So the Bar definitely needing some buffs. If they're not going to do the gun depression changes to increase it, then I would highly recommend increasing the speed and the turning speed of this thing, because otherwise you are just a big slab of hit points that people can take away from you, and really there's not a whole lot to it. Sturmtiger, probably in, as with the Sturmtiger P and the Sturmpanzer, in a decent spot. I feel like maybe it could do with a little bit of a buff, give it slightly more penetration on its premium, so that it has maybe 130 pen as opposed to the 115. But overall, it's a big derpy tank that is relatively fast and also has a decent traverse speed. So not a lot I would change about it. I think it is what it is. That is the style of tank. Is it ever going to be the competitive meta on World of Tanks console? No, but that's not what the tank is for. It's for fun. It's to have that derp cannon. That's exactly what it offers. Don't feel like it needs a whole lot of changes. Otherwise, you start coming into the realms of giving it a huge alpha damage gun that's also a meta vehicle. Yeah, it could potentially cause some issues, so that's kind of what I would do with this tank. In terms of the Borsig and the Waffenträger E100 line and the Gorilla 15, all of the tier 7 and above, these are all perfect tanks. I think they suit the playstyle that they are supposed to be. I don't think they need any changes. Stura Emil is actually a bit of an underrated tank. Once you get past that it is quite slow and has an insane amount of gun depression, it becomes really, really fun to use. I genuinely, out of the entire tech tree line leading up to the Waffle E100, the Gorilla, this is on par with the Borsig, if not slightly more fun, because I like the underrated tanks, and this is definitely one of those. So definitely doesn't really need any buffs. I just don't think people know how to play it, which is why I think the vehicle gets this renowned as being a bit of a weird one to actually play. Then we got the Borsig, fine. Waffle Panzer 4 in a good spot. Those doesn't really need any changes. Waffle E100, it is what it is, does what it says on the tin, doesn't really need any changes. Gorilla 15 probably could do with some actual dispersion changes to make it more of a laser than it is already, because its dispersion really ruins this vehicle, and it's supposed to be a quick vehicle, but when you have things like the Terran, which is almost a direct competitor, the Gorilla 15 doesn't have a fully traversable turret, it's got horrible dispersion values, it's not as fast, it does less damage. What does the Gorilla 15 have over the Terran? Not a lot. And so yeah, definitely could do with a little bit of a change, maybe give it 850 alpha, something like that, to compete with some of the other tanks in the line. That's kind of what I would be thinking with this tank. Artillery we're not going to do in this video because screw artillery. Then we'll move on to the French tanks. In terms of French tanks that I think could potentially deal with a buff, because you just don't really see them. AMX M4 MLE 54 could maybe give it a slightly different maybe give it slightly more DPM, make it a bit more competitive as a heavy tank. With the 400 alpha gun, it does get 2 guns, I believe, with 600 or 560. So yeah, maybe give that more DPM as well. And just generally, I think that could do with it. Maybe make it 45 kilometers an hour top speed, make it slightly faster. I think that would be a good place for this tank. Same with the AMX M4 MLE, slightly more DPM, slightly faster to 45 kilometers an hour top speed, and I think you'd be in a good place. And then with the AMX 65T, similar thing, 45 kilometers an hour, slightly more DPM. I feel like that will work out those tanks quite nicely. Tier 7's absolutely fine. I think this is actually a really underrated tank. Think of it like a French Tiger that is probably better, to be honest with you. Yeah, really, really powerful vehicle. Then we move on to the AMX 5100. This sort of tank, I don't really know how I would change it. Maybe making the dispersion slightly better, just so that it's a little bit more accurate. And I think that would probably be the same for the AMX 5120 as well. Don't think it needs a whole host of changes. Those would probably be enough. 50B is fine. I think it's in a good place. We've got the Lorraine 40T, similar story, just a bit better dispersion when moving. That would be better. Then we've got the Batchat 25 TAP, similarly better dispersion when moving slightly to keep up with the common tanks of now. This is a very old tank and barely ever gets used. Maybe give it slightly better DPM as it is on the lower side. I think that could probably help this tank out a little bit and make it a bit more competitive, bring it back to the forefront of an autoloader that you might actually want to use. The Batchat 25 TAP, similar story to the Batchat 25T. That's what I would do. Then we've got the Batchat 12T and the French light tanks, absolutely fine as they are. Don't think they need any changes. 30B, I would maybe make some differences between the 30B and the Leopard 1, because right now the Leopard 1 is just a better version of the AMX 30B. Very little changes that I would make to this tank. Maybe give it some slightly better armor on the turret, maybe, just so that it has something different to the Leopard 1. And similarly with the AMX 30 over the Leopard PTA, that's what I would do, just to make it slightly different. It can have worse DPM, but have slightly better armor. It distinguishes them, makes it worth actually playing some of these tanks. Then we got the wheeled light tanks. I'm not really going to comment. I feel like these tanks are a bit clunky on console with regards to the movement. And yeah, I'm not even entirely sure that I'll ever actually go towards them. I probably will when we get all of the other tier 10s in the game, and then I'll make my way towards them. But yeah, nothing I would really comment on because I haven't played them properly in the game. Then we've got the French Arty, as I say, not going to comment on those. Then we've got the Foch 155. We've got, of course, the two options for the Foch 155. It's got a 400 alpha damage gun with a 6-shot autoloader that is absolutely amazing when you use it properly. And then you've got the 770 alpha. In terms of buffing this thing, maybe changing the 770 alpha to a 4-second reload. Intra-clip reload, that is, would make it slightly better. And of course, yeah, I think that would pretty much be the thing I would change about this tank. The 400 alpha damage gun I would change, probably not a whole lot. I feel like it's in a good place. Maybe give the Foch slightly better armor, as it does get penned through the front by people auto-aiming it. which is a bit of a problem. So it kind of detracts away from being able to pen it in the cupolas, which are quite prominent on this vehicle. So maybe making and forcing players to actually aim at the giant weak points rather than just being able to auto aim at this tank probably would be giving it a slight armored buff. Of course, punishing people for not actually aiming would be a good thing in the game and make it more usable for a lot of people, as they are not the easiest tanks to get hold of and play. As same for all of the previous tanks. That's what I would do. AMX AC46, I've really enjoyed this tank actually, even though it is not a meta vehicle, and essentially relies on having good camo by putting on all of the camo perks. I would definitely improve the camo of this tank, even though it is gigantic, and just make it slightly better with its DPM, but it's still in a good place. I really think that this tank is just one of those that you can't really do too much to it to actually buff it. It's just one of those tanks that you're going to have to grind through, and just to make it a little bit easier, just buffing some of the accuracy stats maybe to make it slightly better. Then we move on to the Chinese tech tree. These are some of the tanks that I would recommend. 113, basically you never see it in the game. It has 7 degrees of gun depression, which is pretty decent, but it definitely could do with some more DPM just to bring it up to the same levels as what you see with the Super Conqueror, considering that it is a slightly lower profile with basically very little armor on the 113. Yeah, could definitely do with some buffs with that. Maybe they'll buff the upper plate of this thing to make it more in line. And also, cupolas wise, they're fine. It's really just a case of giving it slightly better statistics. Just that increased DPM would make it much better, and the upper plate would make it much better as well. Yeah, I think that would kind of change the 113 into a usable tank. And the power to weight ratio, maybe you could buff that up, make it a bit faster, and that would make it more useful. WZ111-5A, pretty good tank. I think it is what it is. I don't think there needs to be some drastic changes to this thing. Maybe make it 55 kilometers an hour, but overall a pretty solid vehicle anyway. Similar to what you'd see with an Object 277 from the Soviet line. As far as vehicles before that, IS-2 and the 110 could do with some buffs. The IS-2, very, very inaccurate dispersion, makes it really annoying to actually hit people because it is just so inaccurate and the aiming time is not great. So maybe buffing those by a small margin. We're not talking hugely, but just enough to make it a bit more usable and kind of make people actually want to grind through to get these 2 last vehicles that I've got to unlock from the Chinese line. Of course, then we move on to the mediums. I actually found all of these mediums to be okay. Obviously, I didn't play the T-34-2 because we went off of the WZ-132, but I will do. These tanks, maybe give them slightly more HE penetration, give them something nuanced, just so that they have a little bit of something different. And if you pen things with a HE, could be really fun. Yeah, it would be kind of cool to have that in the game. Make them kind of more of a HE potential. I think that could be a thing. But yeah, overall, change slightly the DPM, but it's not horrible. They're just vehicles that I think, you know, aren't meta, and so they're kind of in that sort of region where they're not awful, but they're not great, and probably most people will struggle with them. But yeah, I think, yeah, there's not a whole lot I could really suggest with these tanks. Maybe making them slightly more accurate. I'm not talking majorly. Knock off a couple of points of dispersion, probably make them a little bit better to play. Then we got the light tanks. Light tanks wise, I really enjoyed playing all of the tier 6 all the way up to the tier 8. These were fantastic light tanks. Genuinely, when you play them correctly in a true light tank set fashion going around, yeah, really, really fun. WZ-132A, probably a bit less so, but it was still a very good tank. And then the WZ-132-1, this tank kind of was a bit of a miss for me. I would actually drop off some of the alpha damage to get a better DPM and more kind of fire rate on this tank. Having the 390 does limit it quite big, so I would change that about this tank if I was going to change anything, just to make it more in line with some of the other light tanks and give it a bit more fighting power when you do circle someone, as opposed to having to wait like 9 seconds to reload or 8 seconds to reload. That's kind of what I would do. Then tank destroyers wise, I think they're in a good place. I wouldn't really recommend changing anything about them. They kind of do what is on the tin, and that is basically what it is. I don't think there's a huge amount to be changed about these tanks. Then we move into the Czech line. The tier 10 and tier 9 medium tanks, absolutely insane. These do not need buffs at all. I think they're in an amazing place. They're in a very balanced place whereby they don't have armor, but they have a lot of other things to kind of counteract that. It's a very nice playstyle with these tanks. They definitely don't need any buffs in my opinion, and hopefully we don't see them because they'll make them super OP. The TVP VTU definitely could do with some better accuracy. This tank has horrible accuracy when you're using the big gun, and it's because of the dispersion values that it gets. It's just not fun when you're using this tank. Its armor model really does suck. You're not bouncing anything, and I don't think it needs to have any changes to that. But yeah, I don't really know what I do with it. Dispersion, slightly improved. Speed, power to weight ratio, actually pretty good, so can't really do a whole lot with that. Just don't think it's a meta vehicle, and that's probably the problem with it. And it's kind of that weird hybrid. Maybe even give it a double shot autoloader where it has 240 alpha for 2 shots. That would be kind of interesting as a console exclusive, but they're probably not going to do that. And then T-34-100, I think this tank is fine. It's kind of what's suited with these sorts of vehicles. Then you've got the heavy tank line. I actually think all of these tanks are pretty good. The VZ-44-1 is a little bit weird, but it's, you know, you have to go through some average, such mediocre tanks to get the better tanks. VZ-55, kind of annoying that you don't get the double pumper until after you get the top gun or the starting gun, so I still have yet to actually unlock the double pumper on this account. So yeah, a bit of an annoying thing for sure. Would definitely change it so it's the other way around, so you can use the single shot after you get it. The whole point of getting the VZ-55 is to have the double pumper and then to be kind of forced into playing 62,500 XP's worth to get the next one, albeit it's not a huge amount, is annoying. And so that's why I haven't even done it on this account. So yeah, either way, moving on, we have then got the Italian tanks. So the Italian tanks, in terms of buffing some of these, Progetto line, these are all absolutely fine. I don't think there's really a whole need for any changes with these. Maybe they'll buff some of the lower tier stuff, don't really know. The Italian TDs, they are what they are. I think that there isn't a whole lot I would change about them. Maybe they could buff the speed by like a small margin, make it 34 kilometers an hour top speed, increase the power to weight ratio by like 2 just to make it a little bit faster, so that it can get into position to use its armor quicker. Yeah, other than that, don't really see any issues with this tank. It is a novel, unique tank alongside all of the rest of them. So yeah, just those small changes would make it more usable. And then we go down to the Rinoceronte. This tank definitely needs some increases to DPM to make it just useful in the game, because it can be a little bit useless when you do play it. Similarly, all of the tanks behind it, they could do the same sort of thing. Armor models don't work entirely as you'd hope with these things. So yeah, it can be a problem, especially on the lower tier vehicles, the Progetto 66, the Progetto 54, the Caro. All of these don't really have that strong armor, which is the whole point of playing a heavy tank from the Italian line, is to have armor, but then you don't have it. So yeah, I would recommend buffing the armor slightly of these things, but not massively. The Rinoceronte doesn't really need an armor buff, but make it just slightly more DPM, reduce the disparity between the clips that you have in this thing, or the shell delay, and that's kind of what I would do. So that's kind of all of the tech tree tanks, or my opinion on some of them, and giving an opinion on them. Of course, the lower tier tanks, they're probably going to get changes as well, to make them more in line with the game, but I didn't want to cover every single thing, but just kind of the key ones. And then we've got the Mercenary tanks. These are all getting changed, or not all of them, but some of the tanks. And so the tanks that I would change, or I don't want to see changed, at least we'll do that first, is the Machine. The Machine is in a good spot right now. It's a pretty strong vehicle, especially when played by a good player. Making this tank have better armor which is probably what people would want from this thing, is a big no-no, I think, in my opinion. That is what holds this tank back. It's what stops people from just YOLOing you in this thing. And that is kind of what I would not change. I just don't think this tank needs to change. The machine is a very good vehicle. And as soon as you buff the kind of main weak point of it, being the armor, that just brings in a whole host of problems. And essentially you're already having the TVP T5051 being the alternate version that's slower, has the same gun, and yeah, doesn't get the armor. So when you have the machine, what's the point in playing the TVP T5051 other than getting better view range? So just be aware of that if you're interested. I don't think the machine needs any buffs. The chisel definitely doesn't need any buffs. The tusk doesn't really need any buffs. Tier 9's hard case, probably nerf the armor on the side and give it just better DPM and just make the tank better, because at the end of the day this tank is reliant on that side armor whereby you can literally sit side on and it's better. And so yeah, I would just make that disparity slightly less so that it still has very good side armor, but the actual tank is usable behind the armor, which I think is probably the biggest case for the hard case. Sharpshooter, nothing really to run home about. I think this is in a good place. Cruncher probably needs a bit of something. It feels lackluster just in general. Better DPM, probably make this tank usable. All of the rest of these, I'm not going to go into all of them, but the tank, I'll go into the ones that I don't think need a buff so you guys can get an idea. Slapjack doesn't need a buff. The long reach definitely doesn't need a buff. Spyglass, I would give this more ammunition. Stinger, give it more ammunition, but they don't need changing otherwise. What else have we got? We've got Long Bomb, don't really need any changes. It's a derp cannon, 82, so don't really need any changes there. And then the low tiers, nothing really to write home about there. I'm not even going to mention them. But yeah, those are the tanks and the tech tree nations that potentially are going to get changed. Wargaming have confirmed that it is the Chinese, Czech, French, Italian, German and Mercenary nations that have received stat changes. So yeah, over 90 vehicles have been balanced. So pretty much some of the ones that we're talking about are going to get changed, almost certainly. And if you've got any recommendations, or maybe you think some of the things I've said aren't necessarily true, let me know, because at the end of the day, I am one person. My opinion means no more than your guys's, and I'm not ever going to try and make that out. And of course, having our voice heard by Wargaming is something that I think is really, really important, and I always try my best to convey that to Wargaming, because at the end of the day, I'm here for you guys. I'm not here for Wargaming to do anything in particular. I just want to have the value for you guys. So make sure that you let me know what you actually think of things and what you want to see, because you guys are the ones driving what you're going to see on the channel, and hopefully you enjoy what you see. But those were my opinions on some of these tanks. Hopefully it gives you an indication of some of the tanks you might even want to get in the game, given my kind of mini reviews of the tanks and what's changing. Or what I would like to change about them, I should say. But yeah, I'm interested to see what you guys say in the comment section, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day. Have a great weekend, or what's left of it, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.